Well, hello and welcome to Uncensored CMO. Now, don't switch channels. It's not that Jon has suddenly got a woman's voice. My name's Antonia Wade. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of PwC. And over a drink in Cannes, Jon and I agreed that it would be a great idea to do a reverse interview. So this week, my guest is Jon Evans. Welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm usually here, though, to be fair, but it's nice to be on the other side for a change. It did sound like a good idea over a few glasses of wine, didn't it?
It did. And it is a good idea because I have come up with some very, very challenging questions for you. And nice to have you
I'm not nervous
on the other
at all,
side.
Honestly.
And, you know, first of all, I have to say congratulations on the show. It's phenomenal. And it was quite interesting as I was doing my prep and going back. You know, you've interviewed some incredible people. We'll come back to that and some of the lessons you've learned and perhaps some of the questions that I asked you in Cannes that got us here. But why don't we start off just with a little bit about you? Not many people start in tax and end up in a company like System One with an incredible podcast. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about, you know, the career, but perhaps focus on the best thing that you've done and maybe one big thing that you might have done differently.
Oh, narrowing it down to one big thing to do differently will be a challenge. Well, you're quite right. I did start out in tax. So my first actual paid job was at Coopers & Lybrand, which then became PwC.
Well, there we go.
So there's a lovely
kind
of full circle moment going on. And it was also working there that I decided that I was going to go into marketing. And I spent, I think, about 9 months working in tax. It was one of those sandwich courses I was doing. My degree was economics and finance. So I always loved maths and I loved economics. I know it'd be hard to imagine now, but I absolutely loved it. And when I was doing people's tax returns, I just met this guy and I was interviewing him and basically telling him how he could save money on his annual tax. And as he talked about his job, I thought, that sounds really interesting. And I just had this little slightly arrogant epiphany, which is like, I want to be on the other side of the table where someone's doing my tax for me. I'm still waiting, by the way, but I want someone else to do my tax and I want to do what your job is. I just said to him, what's your job? And he said, I'm the marketing director of Dun & Bradstreet, which is like this big data company. And it just sounded lots of fun. So I had this weird pivot where I had to go from tax and finance into marketing, which is a bit of a challenge because like not many people are hiring kind of ex-finance people into marketing, but I managed it eventually. I had to do it in a few steps because having left university, I also worked in a merchant bank called Kleinwort Benson. So I was on the trading floor, so I got trading floor experience. I got tax. I did a summer in audit as well. So I had the full kind of full set on finance. But I went and I pitched for a job at Britvic soft drinks rather randomly, but they were looking for a market analyst. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I could like apply my skills in the context of FMCG and got the job, which is great. And then I sort of slowly convinced them to sort of give me a little break in marketing. But it's quite hard, actually. It took me, I'd say 3 or 4 years to edge into the more creative part because I interviewed for a few jobs actually, like on brand manager jobs and got turned down. And they kept on saying, Jon, you're too analytical. You're not creative enough, which I find quite ironic now because I tend to be the most creative person in the room now, rather, But back then, of course, my experience didn't match where I wanted to go.
Well, and I guess we'll come on to this, but one of the things that comes up quite often in your podcast is what makes a good CMO and this idea of really understanding the balance sheet, financial prowess. And so kind of curious to know how that's helped you perhaps more later in your career than it did earlier in your career.
Massively. It's one of probably the top things I'd recommend is real financial literacy and understanding how businesses operate, understanding financial measures, understanding what shareholders are looking for. Because if you can present marketing in the context of business change, you're so much more likely to get it, get what you're doing approved. And there's nothing more embarrassing than kind of going into the boardroom going, oh yeah, look at my kind of TikTok account and how many people like my last post kind of thing. And that, eye rolls everywhere sort of thing. But what I found is that my kind of financial literacy actually put me in really good stead when it comes to doing business cases, selling into a board, it justifying why marketing will transform the business in the long run, value to shareholders, all that kind of thing. And it's sort of like basic sales skills, really, because if you can position what you're doing in the needs of the people you're trying to sell to, and in most cases, that's kind of financial performance. So
it has not escaped my notice that you've evaded the question about what you do differently. So come on, let's have it.
I haven't even done the things about what I did
well.
All
right,
well.
Start with what you did well. Now, you did give me a bit of a warning for this. I picked out
I picked out three things in my career, actually. So the first one was, so I spent about 12 or 13 years at Britvic, doing a number of jobs, category management, trade marketing, that kind of thing. And then I worked in the international team, which I have to say was one of the happiest kind of few years of my life, because I got this brief, which was basically take Robinson's Fruit Shoot, which had been a massive success in the UK, and go and launch it internationally. And it was just like literally like a kid with a train set kind of thing, go, oh, right, I researched all the markets we could launch in. I kind of worked with distributors. I did the launch campaigns, the whole thing. And it was brilliant. That's probably the time in my career where I first got to manage the whole mix.
Yeah.
And at a relatively early stage in my career as well, and got the autonomy to actually be responsible for the whole P&L, the impact the advertising makes, the impact the distribution makes.
So exciting.
And, it's great.
Yeah.
And I had a really good boss as well. And I think working for someone who really believes in you, gives you the support when you fail, picks you up, backs you to make the right decision, that kind of thing was amazing. So I think that's when I learned marketing fully, I think, and was accountable for its success in terms of, getting a business case signed off to launch a new market, being set targets and having to meet them, that kind of thing. So that was really good. And then, interesting, while I was there, I really had a passion for innovation, and I was at a management kind of away day, and we were talking about kind of like I got to a point where I was almost ready to leave. Actually, I was a bit dissatisfied because I'd kind of done everything I wanted to do at Britvic. I couldn't really see the next move. And I think it's Ashridge Business School, I think. Anyway, we're doing this kind of management development program, and they basically got us to do something really simple, but I think it's really helpful in my career. It's like write a Venn diagram of everything the business needs and everything you are passionate about, and find the little overlap. What's the thing the business needs that you're really good at, sort of thing? And I basically went, do you know what? Britvic used to be great at innovation, and it started to get too complex. Its portfolio is growing too big. So I thought, I love innovation. So I'm going to create this, what I called the seed brand team, which is take all the innovation that Pepsi have got globally, go around the world, find like the next big thing, bring it to the UK and launch it, but launch it like in its own separate teams, the company. And it was so cool. And I went from, I think it's on the Friday I came up with the idea. On the Monday, I was pitching it to two of the board members. And within 4 months, I got something like £6 million signed off. I had a direct team of 12, an indirect team of 40. And we had some brands that existed, like those brands in every portfolio that everyone loves, but they're forgotten about.
Yeah.
We had like this little brand called Purdy's, which is like this natural energy drink, way ahead of its time. So I moved that into my portfolio to give me a bit of revenue. And then I launched Mountain Dew, Lipton Iced Tea, Gatorade, V-Water. I had all these brands from America. I thought pretty cool. And then in 3 years went from 7 million to 50 million.
Wow.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, incredible.
But then it leads me to my third thing, because I remember sat in a meeting 3 years later and someone saying to me, yeah, it's only 50 million, Jon. That's like 2% of the company. And I sat there and went, yeah, do you know what? In my world, that is outrageously successful. And I feel so proud. But because I was part of the broader company incentive scheme and the broader company had not done that well, I didn't see any of those rewards.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, that's, 50 million if it was my own business, I'd be like, dining out and I'll be retiring, right? But 50 million in a 1 billion or 1.5 billion company doesn't feel so amazing. So I decided to what I actually decided to do is try and buy some of those brands off Britvic. And unfortunately,
why not?
Yeah, why not? I know. Do you know what? It's one of those you asked me about like lessons and stuff. Sometimes I think you should just take a punt on things.
Don't ask, don't get.
I know. And I actually went to a private equity company and said, will you give me some money to buy these 3 brands in the Britvic portfolio that have basically been forgotten about? But I reckon they're high margin. They've got a great rate of sale. They've got a legacy, or the whole thing, right? And I reckon a bit of focus would be great. And unfortunately, timing didn't suit me, because I'd got the deal pre-approved and I went to the boardroom. And in that particular board meeting, there was a big crisis on Fruit Shoot, actually, where there was a cap problem, and some kid had almost choked on a cap, and this is a big product recall. Wiped 30% off the company valuation. So the feedback was, there's no way we're going to do your £2.5 million deal, Jon, because we got much bigger things to worry about. So that deal went, but I'd already got quite far down the road with the private equity company, and I'd pretty much left in my head.
Right.
And then at the same time, they'd also bought a small soft drink company in the Midlands called Purity. And the idea was I was going to buy these brands, And then we were going to manufacture them in this new this company they had bought, and I was going to basically be the owner of the brands, and then I was going to use the manufacturing they had acquired. So I had the manufacturing, but I didn't have the brands. So in the end, what happened is I left anyway, and then became kind of marketing director of this little juice company in the Midlands that no one ever heard of.
Right.
So it was like rather. But anyway, the reason I'm really proud, that's my third kind of proud thing, is that was my first time, I suppose, being an entrepreneur, because I had a small ownership in the company. I had almost no budget whatsoever. And I was in the factory day in, day out. So I was dealing with kind of trade disputes or, salary changes or the factory breaking down or customer supply break, all that sort of thing. And it was actually the first time where I was like actually running a business from the bottom to the top, nuts and bolts, everything sort of thing. And that was pretty cool.
And quite interesting to go from such a big company to something that's so small. And that's something that I get asked quite a lot actually by people about, should you start big? Should you go small? How do you make those decisions? Maybe just give us a bit of a view for your listeners about, how do you think about the environment that you're going to flourish in the most? And how should you kind of figure out whether you are best suited to something more corporate and structured or something kind of more nimble and small?
Yeah. I think probably the answer to that question is, to what extent do you like the autonomy versus the matrix? I think is probably the dynamic. So, I mean, to dramatize it, on my first day at PwC, as I always did at Britvic, I'd write down my to-do list at the beginning of the day, at 7 a.m. or whatever, and try and work through it during the day. When I arrived at PwC, my first day, I'd done everything by 9:30, and I had no meetings in the diary. I had one meeting a week, right? And then suddenly it's like, oh, this business won't move forward unless I decide what needs to be done and make it happen, sort of thing. So suddenly you're hands-on. So I was the Twitter handle. I designed the company uniforms. I set the website up. I designed the labels. We had something like 14 different flavors of juice. I sat in a lab with our lab technicians approving every single one of them, sort of thing. So if you like the sort of hands-on actual responsibility, it doesn't happen unless you do it, kind of autonomy feeling. It is great. If you like the kind of kudos of big organization and like being part of a broad team and managing the kind of matrix organization and all that comes with that, they're very different.
Yeah.
And I don't imagine that many people kind of thrive in both.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that if you enjoy the complexities of something big, matrixed, then part of your energy and drive and satisfaction from the job comes from being in that environment. So I do think it's quite important in your setting out in your career to figure that out. And I've spent time in government, big companies, small companies, and you sort of do find the environment that fits you best. But yeah, no, it's a kind of interesting to get your perspective on it. Well, but just before we finish off on you, one of the things I enjoyed a conversation that you had with Scott Morrison where you talked about Lucozade and how you kind of went back to the original recipe as you were trying to kind of refresh that brand. You've also talked a few times about the fact that you've been fired from a number of jobs. What would you go back and tell yourself maybe in those moments before you got fired or in those moments where you were gearing up to being fired? If you could go back in time, what would you tell yourself?
That's a really good question. The Lucozade thing's pretty unique. So the context for it, for anyone who's not heard me talk about it, sorry if you have already, but the UK government's introducing a sugar tax. Lucozade was one of the highest sugar drinks in the category, and the impact of sugar tax was worth more than the annual profits of the company. So it was a case of not changing was not an option. So we went all in and reformulated everything, and we discontinued the original recipe, which was 85 years old. And I discovered after the event that diabetics depend on exactly the amount that's in there. Then there's a world of pain that basically just like kind of happened as a result of reformulation. I was giving you a sense of how bad it was. We lost about 20% of our total brand turnover. This brand was about 60% of the total portfolio. We lost 20% in 12 weeks. And I think we lost about £15 million of profit. So we missed all our targets. It was serious enough that it was given as a reason on the Tokyo Stock Exchange for the parent company, Suntory. It was that material that had to be kind of announced on there. And yours truly was the poster boy. So although it was one of those classic things of success has many fathers, but failure's an orphan.
Yeah.
So, although we all held hands and jumped and said, yes, we're going to go into this new world of low sugar reformulation.
All the fingers pointed to you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I've mentioned this before, but the moment I knew I was going to get fired eventually was when we had this sort of town hall meeting and the CEO said, we have a marketing problem. Now, I know what he meant. actually, because as a marketer, I knew as a marketer, you do own the full mix and it's up to me to figure out the solution. But he was telling the company that the marketing team of which I was the chief was the reason for the failure. That's what people heard, right? Even though he probably meant that it's a marketing thing for us to figure out, it didn't come across like that.
You're right.
And politically, I knew, he was he'd been in the business a long time. He was kind of very well respected. So he was looking for a area to blame. And even though when you break it down, there were many reasons for why it didn't work in terms of the formulation that we signed off wasn't the formulation that actually went down the line. The quality control on the line wasn't what it should be, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are a number, and in fact, I did it. One of the big lessons for me actually in that is when something goes wrong, don't jump to conclusions, because what you think is the reason, and everyone gravitates to a quick excuse. They want to know, like, within a week or so, okay, can we explain what went wrong? It took me about 6 months, actually, of proper research, proper investigation to actually work out what was wrong about the formulation and why it wasn't kind of working in the way that we thought it was going to be. And the answers at the end of the 6 months were very different to what we probably assumed at the beginning.
Right.
And again, I had the same thing at Purity, actually, we had a similar quality control issue. Same learning is that you have to do your due diligence and work through the issue and actually come out the other side. So in terms of what I'd have done differently, I think it's a really hard one, actually. My failure was in navigating the politics of that situation, because I found myself in a position where if it was successful, I probably would have been promoted. In fact, I was being talked of as a successor to my boss, which was lovely. But I should have realized that if it went wrong, and there was a very good chance of it going wrong, because of course I'd read the case study on Coke. When Coke relaunched to New Coke back in I think it was the late 80s.
Yeah.
That was a massive disaster, and they had to recall it and basically relaunch it as a classic Coke, right? So I knew that the risks were very, very high, and I probably didn't think through the contingency of what happens if it goes wrong. And so by the time it did go wrong, my card was already marked, and I was basically doing a very slow walk to the exit. Although what they chose to do is set me a load of new KPIs to recover the brand, relaunch, very, very quickly, lots of in-store activity, lots of sampling, lots of advertising. And by the time I left, actually, the brand had recovered and was actually back into growth at 8%. But that was too late because it's
kind of an interesting point. And I know that you talked to Mark Ritson in one of your podcasts about confidence needed as a CMO, because actually if you're always thinking about the plan B and what could happen if something goes wrong, it's actually then quite hard to be confident and to focus everyone towards what you believe is the right outcome. I mean, in all the conversations that you've had with all of the CMOs you've had on the podcast, are there any traits of a confident CMO that you've been able to pick up on?
The most confident CMOs, and there's no shortcut to this, have got tenure and they've established reputation within their business. So like Meg Farron, for example, at KFC is a great example. She's been in the role, I think 7-8 years or something like that. She's now the GM of the UK. And you build that reputation within a business so that people trust you. So there's a lovely example where, you remember the chicken supply issue, where they did the ad saying FCK kind of thing. And she was able to do that without permission from the headquarters in America. But she was able to do that because she built this internal reputation of having good judgment, built good culture, made good decisions. So I think there's definitely a longevity point that you get that. I mean, Dom Dwight at Yorkshire Tea would be another good example of that credibility.
But troublesome if CMO tenure is
I know,
reducing.
this is it. So I think in the shorter circumstance, I think the keys would be database as well, come with the evidence. And I think one of the reasons why I do the podcast is there's so much good evidence for marketing, its impact and how to make decisions and long and the short, all those sorts of things. But I don't see marketers using data enough. They tend to sort of go, trust me, I know what I'm doing, or go on instinct. And actually you need the evidence of your decisions. So I think go with the data is really important.
All right, so we've heard about how you got from tax to soft drinks, but how did you get from soft drinks to one of the leading research companies?
I know, I asked myself the question. And do you know, I genuinely love it. And it was, I've my well-worn getting fired twice in a year story, but I got fired from LRS, and then I went to Brewdog, which was my dream job, and got fired in like about 12 weeks. So I was unemployed, and the market wasn't particularly buoyant for CMOs at the time. And I reached out to some of my agency friends and contacts and said, how can I help? And I was working for 4 or 5 different agencies, design agency, ad agency, PR agency, and System One. And I absolutely love System One's founder, John Kieran, who's just the nicest, most creative, like entrepreneurial guy you'd ever meet.
The importance of having a great boss.
Yes. And he is absolutely, he's also the most generous, friendly person you could ever want to meet as well, and in life and soul of the party. And I cannot thank him enough as well. So in a period of my life where I was in quite a distressful situation where I didn't have a job and that sort of thing, he basically called me up and it was quite a funny brief actually. He just said, could you work for me half day a week? And in the half day a week, he just said, there were 2 jobs he gave me. First job was, I used to be a customer of System of System 1's. Mm-hmm. And he said, you seem to have adopted System 1 and taken it to heart. Could you write a presentation that would have convinced you that we can then send to other CMOs, sort of thing? So he printed out like all the various bits of sales material they'd ever come up with, and he put it all over the floor, and he just said to me, right, pick out what's good, what's bad, and help me get it down to 10 kind of killer, things that we could send to CMOs. So that was my first job. The second job as well was the System 1 at that point had just come up with the idea of testing everything in the market, which was a really bold idea.
Right.
It was a lovely
rather than just who pays you to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like a bit like AC Nielsen kind of might measure your market share, in the kind of drinks market, as I would have been. They basically thought that we could basically provide a total view of creativity, not just for you, but all your competitors. And then you can benchmark how you are versus your competitors, because the science suggests that your ability to outperform your category creatively, it's a bit like outspending them, is that being more creative is as important as spending more than them. And the two things are about equally important. But we could provide the intel on kind of the market. And I just thought it was a genius idea. But at the time, we had no customers, but we just created the capability of doing it. So my job was to then package it, merchandise it, sell it, and create a way of selling it, sort of thing. So I was kind of working for the business part-time, half day a week sort of thing. And as part of that, Jon invited me to Cannes, and he said, come and talk on a panel. And while I was just after the panel, I got interviewed by CNBC, and they asked my feedback on Lions. And I said, you won't be surprised to hear this, but I said, look, the one person not in Cannes is the customer. Yeah. And so I waxed on about, I think we should involve the customer a bit more in Cannes and celebrating creativity. And he looked around the camera at the end, and he said, you're the first uncensored CMO I've met all week.
Love it.
And I thought, there's an idea, because at the time, so unlike, the corporate roles I'd had before where I'd be trained on PR and I did media training quite a few times. I love media training. I found it a really good kind of like sparring exercise.
It's a good confidence builder, yeah.
It's great, isn't it? You learn a hell of a lot. But what I found is in my role at System 1, I'm much more free to have a point of view on marketing more generally. So I'm unlikely to say anything that's going to upset my bosses sort of thing or shareholders. So that freedom I thought was quite useful. And then the other thing is I wanted a reason to meet CMOs, and I wanted a reason to kind of get System 1 talked about. And so that's where the podcast idea came from. So the two things married together absolutely beautifully. And I've got to say, I've loved System 1 so much because I've really learned to craft, and I've learned, how to use the data. I've learned kind of the theories of advertising and marketing and branding and innovation in a way that I never knew before. I might have known it instinctively, but I really, really know it in some depth, which has been brilliant. And I've also got a breadth because we work with so many customers globally. I get to talk to, like, from an uncensored CMO point of view and from a Chief Customer Officer, System 1 point of view, I get to talk about business problems with CMOs all over the world and help them solve them. And I love it. And it's been really good. And so I'm massively grateful. I never thought I'd end up working for a research company. It wasn't on my bingo cards, but having done it, I absolutely love it. And I've been given the freedom, and I've also been able to make a big, big difference to the company in a way that maybe in a bigger organization, I might have been more limited. I've been able to use my kind of creativity and entrepreneurialism. Yeah,
found the right environment for you. Yeah, it's a really wonderful story. And one of the things I really like about it, because I think we've all been in this situation, you work really hard, you apply for jobs, you do your best, but very often your real break comes with somebody taking a chance on you. And it's really lovely to hear, how System 1 took a chance on you. And, many of us have had that in our career. There's a person or there's an organization that just takes that chance. And I think that really speaks to being able to see potential and create an opportunity for that person.
And actually, going to talk about advice for anyone listening as well, I think interviewing your potential boss is the best thing you can ever do in a process, because I think your boss has a bigger
looking for a job at PwC.
Yeah, here we go. Breaking news, ladies and gentlemen.
Back to PwC.
PwC. Yeah, that'd be full circle, wouldn't it? The tax department, PwC, has been taken over by this renegade podcast host. What happened there? That'd be quite a move. But one of the biggest lessons I've learned, I used to chase the name above the door or the challenge within the job. I think if I had my time again, I'll be thinking about who do I want to work for? And I'd pick somebody that had my back, I could really learn from, and would give me the freedom and support to really jump and make some brave moves. So I think if you're sitting here applying for a new job, thinking about a new job, think much, much, much more about who you're going to work for than the company itself. I think that's so important. And so, and actually just to say as well, Jon, amazing. My current boss, James, who took over 18 months ago as well, he was our chief operating officer before. He's been amazing as well. And he's continued that level of backing for some of the ideas I've come up with, the approach on the podcast, the partnerships we created, some of the kind of wacky ideas we've come up with marketing wise. It's been great. So
yeah, makes sense. And so you've now done over 150 episodes. Congratulations. What a phenomenal achievement. Your first one was with Richard Shotton. Why did you choose him? And what's directed your choices ever since then?
Well, firstly, I wanted to start with a bang. So Richard met a few criteria for me. So firstly, he's a very interesting speaker. So he's a very good communicator of kind of he makes ideas very simple and applicable to business. So I thought that's really good. He had a book coming out as well, and I found that actually same with you actually. Like authors are great because they're subject matter experts. They really know what they're talking about. They can communicate very well, and they've got an incentive to be on the show because the book kind of thing, which is very good. And Richard also had a good social media following. So in my head, I was thinking, how do I get reach with an interesting person with a subject that I think is going to connect with a broad audience? And that was why I picked him first.
And it is a great episode, by the way. I would recommend anyone to go back and listen to it. It's phenomenal.
Thank you. It's funny actually because like I wasn't particularly well prepped for episode number one. I'm probably a lot better now than I was then. So I find it weird listening back to me back then, sort of thing. But
lucky
also,
for you, Richard was good.
Well, Richard was great, and exactly. But that's also the thing. So one of my criteria for guests is they have to be interesting and they have to be easy to talk to because it's a conversation. You don't want it just to be kind of a one-way question answer. It's lovely to have a conversation. So I am looking for people that can communicate very fluently. But the interesting thing about the podcast kind of growth versus then is when Richard did his follow-up book a couple of years later, had him back on the podcast, and within 24 hours of that episode, we had downloaded more of that episode than the prior, I think, 2 or 3 years of that first episode. So it just shows the difference between kind of episode one, and I can't remember which episode he was on the second time, but the podcast has grown so much that just in 24 hours, we beat that episode's lifetime downloads. Yeah,
and it's interesting because I obviously went back a little bit to kind of look at, who you've interviewed and what you've talked about. And of course, you started it just kind of before COVID. And it was a bit of a walk back in time because so many of your early podcasts were all about marketing in a crisis, how do you deal with this kind of externality that you hadn't expected? And then I kind of listened to the most recent ones and I'm like, how much of what we learned during COVID actually still happens now? I mean, you must have a good sense of that. I sort of feel like it was an incubated time and it's almost like that all got put on the shelf and we've gone back to some sort of normal. But there must have been some things that were good about that period that perhaps we should have pulled forward. I don't know what your view is on that.
No, that's a great question. And it's interesting as well because I started the podcast doing a series. And when COVID hit, a genuine question, me and producer James are talking about is, do we continue with this, right? Is it relevant? I mean, should we have a podcast going? But what I found is that actually during COVID it was really interesting. People wanted to listen, wanted to connect, because the thing we couldn't do during COVID was, connect with people in the way that we did before. And actually, I think podcasting started to explode during that time because people were looking for ways to stay informed and connect with people and listen.
And also, what else were other people doing, right? Because you kind of have to dig deep for new ideas.
Walk a day or whatever, And I also found it therapeutic. Myself, I actually being isolated, I actually found it very good for my mental health to be able to talk to people about what they were facing and kind of share insight and learning. So it was actually quite valuable to me, actually, just irrespective of anyone listening, was actually part of me kind of getting through that time, really, in a way. But one of the there was a report by Clear M&C Saatchi. It's a really good episode, actually, looking at the role of a CMO in a crisis. And it was very interesting because basically what it was saying is that when times are going well, there's not as much pressure on the CMO to lead. As soon as you're in a crisis, the CMO is expected to step up. And what they were looking at is, what does the CEO think the CMO should be doing, and what does the CMO think the CMO should be doing, sort of thing. But what was interesting about COVID is suddenly the spotlight is all on the CMO. Like, what's our long-term plan to get out of this? What should we be investing? How should we be investing? What are our strategy and tactics? That kind of thing. What can we do now that we couldn't do before, and vice versa. And so I think it was a wake-up call to CMOs to lean in and lead the business. There's also, of course, well-known evidence that actually investing in a crisis can give you, excess share of voice, for example, and, allow you to kind of get a once-in-a-lifetime shift on your competitors. And weirdly, I think we're in a not that different period now, actually, where marketing spend as a percentage of revenue is down to almost COVID levels across, on average. And we are operating in an era where we're asking CMOs to do more with less investment. It's not that dissimilar, actually,
right,
to sort of COVID times. And I think hopefully we've learned the lesson about, making tough decisions, leading the strategy, leading the business, through a crisis into the future. And I think those skills are as relevant today as they probably were then.
Well, and it's interesting because sometimes as a CMO, your podcast makes quite uncomfortable listening, by which I mean, if you have people from agencies, you have people from kind of the broader industry, all of whom have very strong perspectives on what CMOs should and shouldn't be, right? And you've just talked about, this future-proofing, this strong decision-making, this ability to lead. I also picked up on people saying, we wish the CMOs would be more creative. We wish that CMOs would be more savvy about channel choices, be more into pricing rather than the other Ps, would take a more kind of financially astute position on the board. And as I listen to it as a CMO, I'm like, wow, I mean, I don't know that it's possible to be the CMO that everyone would want a CMO to be. I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts about that, because you've heard, obviously, and then you've spoken to all of these incredible CMOs, many of whom display many of those traits, but probably be quite unusual to find somebody who's got all of those things. Just give us a bit of a sense of, what are the commonalities that you see across the CMOs you interview? And if you think about what the people who work with CMOs are asking for, what advice would you give CMOs to kind of really lean into?
Well, number one, you're spot on, right? Number one, there is no perfect CMO, and every CMO,
apart from this one,
of course, obviously goes without saying, the two of us on this conversation. But no, generally, there is no perfect CMO, and you can't. I mean, I know Ritson attempts to do the perfect CMO that does everything, sort of thing. It's kind of this hybrid thing, and look, that doesn't exist. We're all individuals. We've all got different experience. We all have natural traits and things that we're strong at and things we're not at. I had a lovely conversation with Kofi Gottfried, actually, at DoorDash. And what struck me about his journey is, even though he's in a very senior position, multi-billion pound organization, absolutely nailing it and growing in the US, he doesn't feel he's the finished article yet. He's still learning. And as he talked through his career, he's like, I needed to go from agency to client. I needed to go from client to sort of brand owner. I need to go from brand owner to, kind of an area where I could learn products, and so he was really thinking through very carefully how to get the kind of complete, kind of rounded CMO, but he wasn't thinking of himself as finished article. So he had a massive appetite for learning. He was conscious about the choices he made in his career to try and make himself a rounded marketer. He was also challenging himself, so he wasn't sitting still. He was always thinking, like, what's the next thing I can go to? So I think that appetite for learning and appetite for gaining experience and pushing yourself, I think, is really important. Other CMOs, I think, have got it really right, like Corey at Elf was one of my favorite ever episodes. Yeah. And what I love about someone like her is she has a real clarity about what matters and about how to get things done in an organization. And she had this brilliant phrase I absolutely loved, which is the distance from the C-suite to the customer. It determines your success, and the distance from insight to action, or the gap between insight and action, determines your success. Such a simple way of putting things. But I think as a CMO, your job is to provide clarity for a whole organization and give them a sense of direction where you're going, and help. Because, I mean, you know this in your role, but the amount of complexity that gets created across organizations, and your job is to cut through it and kind of create that clarity. So I think that's really, really helpful. And then whether it's Mark Jobling or Meg Farron, who I talked about earlier, who really create the conditions for success. And this is something I know that you experience as well, is that when you get to CMO role, there's this weird thing that happens where you're no longer doing. And I found it, I'm not good at it, right? So partly the reason I'm not a CMO, big CMO now, is because I quite like doing. And I found that jump to overseeing. I mean, Lucozade was probably my biggest team and most responsibility. suddenly your job is to facilitate others and to put the conditions for others to be successful and to put the guardrails up or to, empower them or train them or create the culture and those kind of things.
I liked how Chris
Burgrave, yeah,
describes it as you're like the atelier. You've gone from being the artist to being the atelier. And I quite like that as a sort of image of like you then kind of manage a stable of artists who all need things and who all need things from you, but that's not your job anymore. And I think that is a really big shift, because a lot of your joy as a marketer comes from the work. And so suddenly to then not be in the work, and there are some things where I have to say to my team, I'm not going to be able to resist. I will not be able to resist getting my finger, just because I really love this type of work. And so at least knowing and acknowledging it, I'm sure that doesn't really help my team. They're like, oh gosh, keep her out of these ones. But it is a hard shift for sure.
But you talked about creativity as well earlier, and that's another thing is that creativity I found. I should separate creativity from creative, right? So creativity in a CMO role is very important. It's applying your kind of creative thinking to business problems, right? That is critical. But in terms of the creative output that might be advertising, let's say, that's a very small part of the job.
Right.
And most people don't realize it because it's the public bits. Everyone's kind of got an opinion on your ad, right? Actually, your job is like managing people. It's creating strategy. It's finances and managing budget. It's operational, getting projects through the organization. It's aligning stakeholders. It's reporting back to a board. They're the jobs for CMO. It isn't really spending a lot of time with a creative agency just debating the next idea. That's done by your team. And that's what I think most people don't realize is that at the level below, you can be the most senior creative, person or marketer. But when you get to the CMO, you're suddenly part of a cross-functional team that's managing a whole business. I mean, I found this is where actually a small business is really useful, because when I went to PwC, I was on the board and I found maybe only 10% of my time was marketing. It's quite funny in board meetings, and finally, Jon would show his new label design. You know what I mean? It was almost like everyone relaxed at that point.
After we've worked out the electricity bill and our factory structure.
We've just remortgaged the factory or whatever, and worked through a redundancy or two. Anyway, we do all those serious things, and then it would be literally everyone would relax. We'd have a coffee, and then it'd be like, "Oh, Jon, have you got a new brand design to show us?"
Like on the news where they have the jolly story at the end.
And of course, everyone's got an opinion, right? Suddenly it went from we respected each other's kind of disciplines, and then when it gets that bit, everyone's diving in with an opinion about your Pantone's not quite right, or the fruit doesn't look good enough on that.
Well, and that goes back to your point about why data is so important and research and insight. And as I listen to the podcast, you clearly have themes that come up over and over again around creativity, emotion, storytelling. I love the episode about not being boring and the cost of that. But one of the things that I was wondering about as I was listening was, if you think about data and consumer behavior, and you, of course, are very close to that in System 1, does it really support that? Or are you and I just old and we're harking back to those 1980s Nescafe Gold Blend series adverts?
Exactly.
And we all just want that. Yeah. But actually, that's not how consumers buy today.
This comes up a lot, actually. And I think there are two things that are true at the same time. So I think, yes, we as older marketers need to also understand how modern digital channels work, right? I think that's absolutely true. How influencers influence buying patterns and decisions and those kind of things, right? That's absolutely true. And ironically, actually, I found out last week that I've been nominated the UK's #1 digital marketer.
There we go.
So this is a shock to me. So how I managed it, I've got no idea. Anyway, but DM me for any advice on digital marketing strategy. That is true. I mean, we have to be on top of how people are consuming media and those kind of things. On the other side is we have gone through this revolution of the last 20 years, technical revolution, which has changed the way advertising communication is done, and not for the better, because what it's reduced it down to 2 or 3 seconds. It's flattened it. It's made it very. Orlando Wood, my colleague, would talk about showmanship versus salesmanship. The old school. I mean, back in the 20s, it was all salesmanship advertising, which is here are my 15 features and why you should buy. And then there was a creative revolution in the 60s and 70s, which was showmanship, which was entertain people and make them feel something. And we've kind of gone back to the 1920s style of the rational salesman advertising, and we need to rediscover the showmanship. Now, the data I see at System 1 and via people like Orlando is absolute genius and is kind of surfacing all this, is that the way we as humans make decisions is far more emotional than we like to believe. And the brands we remember, the brands that make us feel good, the ones that come to mind quickly, all those kind of heuristics that Daniel Kahneman would talk about in Thinking Fast and Slow, those things are served much better by the kind of advertising that we used to do than we do today. So there's a massive opportunity, and the opportunity is to get the balance right. I'm not saying it should be all one way or all the other way, but the evidence would suggest in terms of what gets our attention, what sticks in memory, what makes us buy in the future, all those things, it is emotion, it's storytelling, it's kind of well-branded ideas that stick in the mind. It's jingles, it's characters. I mean, these things are not, these things are, I know exactly. If you can take a 3p carrot and make it famous, like you've nailed it. But no, so I think I feel confident that I'm on safe ground on this one, that the data would suggest we're not done yet.
Fair enough. But well, that leads me to a question around the data. So, of course, you're all over that. What's your favorite campaign that didn't do well from a data perspective, but you just kind of love it?
Oh, that's a good one. Probably we were doing a website rebrand 3 or 4 years ago for System 1, and it was like each of the exec members was asked to showcase their favorite brands, and so I was like, right, Tango ads are like the best ads ever. I grew up with Tango ads. And I worked on the brand for a short time. I'm like, yeah, it's got to do so well. So I put a load into test again, and it's like, oh, they did all right. They got like 3 stars. I'm like, damn, they should have been 5 stars. And then I think I went, where did I go next? I can't remember the next campaign. It took me about 3 or 4 attempts to get a campaign that I liked to actually get to a 5-star on our system. So I was like, okay, all right. But to be fair to me, only less than 1% of ads we ever measure get to 5 stars. So you have to. Unfortunately, I mean, modern ones I like now would be, I mean, I know I always give Dom Dwight a big call out on this podcast, actually. And every time I do it, he gives me a little text. Thanks, mate. Anyway, so he'll be listening, I know. But I love what they do, for example. And a good example of advertising done well. Kevin the Carrot you talked about is a great example of where kind of advertising that makes you laugh, makes you remember the brand is still good, isn't it? Well,
and you talk about characters and the kind of memorability of that. But maybe, Jon, you just like orange with tango and carrots. Maybe that's it. So the reason this podcast came about was I had the pleasure of interviewing you and Mark Ritson while we were at Cannes. And the first question that I asked you there was, given that you can get so much real-time data and insights and learn from it and use that to shape your strategy, why do you need a Cannes lion? You talk a lot about lions on this podcast, and I'm just curious about whether you think that their time is done.
Oh, lovely question. I think it's for us to work out what the role of Cannes is. I think that's the key question, isn't it? And so years ago, I worked on a campaign when I was at Lucozade, actually, with Anthony Joshua, called "No One Ever Moved Forward Standing Still," and we won a couple of lions on that, which was lovely. But it's interesting that the lions we won, I mean, that was an enormously effective campaign. So it was probably in that Venn diagram, which is quite a small Venn diagram of like creatively celebrated and wildly effective,
right?
Actually, which I would love to do a study on, find out what are those ones that the creative industry thinks is amazing and has been wildly effective in real life.
Well, you have done a bit of a study on that, haven't you? And you tend to find that there's not much of a, those circles aren't crossing very often.
So like Cheetos would be a good example. So Cheetos is one of those brands that is creatively celebrated regularly and is very, very effective as well. And actually this Anthony Joshua campaign would be a good example. So we won for Filmcraft, I think the soundtrack. I think it was Filmcraft and soundtrack, which we got. So what I think Cannes does very well is recognise and celebrate craft and the particular elements of it, whether, things like soundtracks and acting and editing and all those sorts of things. So I think it gives a real showcase of that craft element. I think it used to be very predictive of effectiveness, and it's become less so. And I think part of that is fashion. I think it's because we've become very obsessed on purpose. We've looked, I think the awards are more short-term activations, so things that get talked about more than the things that maybe are effective day to day. And there's also it's not, being effective can be boring, right? So doing Kevin the Carrot 7 years in a row is not going to win you a Cannes, but is a very, very effective thing to do. Because also what we know at System 1 is that good advertising compounds over time. So take Kevin the Carrot, right? That started as a 3.8 star. It's now a 5.8 star. Now, the creative has evolved. I'm not saying it hasn't changed. Every year they adapt it, but the core idea is the same. Coke Trucks is another one at Christmas, right? Wildly effective, but isn't going to win any awards. So I think that the difference is if you look over a long term, what's effective over a long term is not necessarily going to be the thing that is new and novel and necessarily reflects a particular craft that might win you an award. Now, having said that, so I think that's why the Venn diagram is quite a small Venn diagram of overlap. What's massively reassuring, and again, I know the guys over at Essential pretty well, is they've put an effectiveness track on for the last 3 years, and that has become so popular. So this year, Adam Morgan and I did the extraordinary cost of being dull as a wake up to the industry to say, look, you can't afford to be dull because you're wasting your money, and the cost of being dull on average is £10 million a campaign, right? So why not be more interesting and more engaging? And what's lovely about that is they tell me that the effectiveness track was the most popular one this year. So what I hope is we're going to see this kind of like slight reverse back into celebrating the craft and novelty and innovation within creativity, but remembering that the business context and the customer is king. And if you find that overlap, that'd be great.
So one of the things you just talked about was purpose. And I know you do a podcast around purpose and how we leaned more towards purpose than we need to. Sorry, not a question that I told you I was going to ask, so hopefully it's all right. But when we look at the data at PwC, we do not see consumer behavior really markedly shifting into those more purposeful companies, although all of us would wish that that would happen. And I do think that marketing and advertising plays a huge role in challenging or encouraging certain consumer sentiment. And so that kind of leaves me in a bit of a quandary around some of this purpose-based advertising. Because on one hand, you do want to shift people towards caring as much about purpose as perhaps price. But on the other hand, it needs to be both genuine and real. And I don't know, I'm just kind of interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, totally. And look, and the answer is in the middle. I'm almost pretty sure about this because... So number of things to say. Firstly, having done a bit of research on purpose, we looked at the iPay database. Peterfield looked at the iPay database and looked at awards that were purpose-based and those that are non-purpose-based. And at the top line level, the purpose ones underperformed the non-purpose ones by about 40%. I'm making it up slightly, but it's an order of magnitude of about that. It lagged. I think it was like 1.6 business effects versus 1. It was that kind of ratio, right? So at a macro level, there's an interesting observation there that ones that lent wholly into purpose were overall less effective. Now, that's the sum of everything, right? And he goes to great lengths to say within that, you've got some amazing purpose campaigns. Now, the interesting thing about the amazing purpose campaigns is they were authentic to the company's reason for being. And that, I think, is so important because if you are in business to make recyclable clothing or to take child labour out of a supply chain or, et cetera, or save CO2 when flying, right? If that's your purpose, then of course purpose matters, right? I think if you're a brand that isn't on this earth to do something like that and you co-opt a purpose that's not your reason for being, I think that's when you get into this kind of sticky situation. So the pendulum swung so far that everyone had to have a purpose, even when it wasn't authentic. And that, I think, is where it gets kind of problematic.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting, though, because you would want consumers to take into account the purposeful nature of a company, even if it's not a purpose-based product, because that's buying behavior shift will encourage companies to change how they think about supply chains or whatever else. So I think that there's something kind of interesting in that as well, which is, of course, marketing purpose, if that is not the core of your business. However, trying to encourage consumers to take into account the impact that they're having on the planet or supply chains or whatever, as they're making decisions, particularly if they're a bit price insensitive, I think probably is quite important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also think that the other kind of basic point to make is we should all do the right thing. Right. So whether it's like representation advertising or whether it's reducing carbon in your supply chain, we should all do that. Right. So that shouldn't even be a debate. Right. We should, as kind of employers, public citizens, we should be doing the right thing. So that and I think sometimes in the purpose debate, people, if you're kind of anti-purpose or whatever, you somehow think that you should destroy the planet. And that's never the case.
Right.
So I think it's the case we should do the right thing. The other thing to say as well is in this bit of research, we did a bit of research, System 1, around the same time Peter did his research. And we looked at purpose-led campaigns on the System 1 database, found a very interesting observation, which is in a B2B context, purpose came up quite high. So we like to do business with people that are responsible and doing the right things, whether it's people, employees, planet, et cetera, et cetera. So actually in the hierarchy of needs, you in a professional services organization actually should be quite high because people that are doing business with you will want to know that you're doing the right thing.
Right.
If you're selling toothpaste, it's less important.
Not so much.
Right? And I think it's just, we have to understand that it has a role to play in certain situations more than others.
So the other big trend that's hitting the marketing world is AI. And when you had a chat with Nils from Uncommon, you were sort of heralding AI as the saviour of creativity. Do you actually really believe that?
No, I don't think it's going to save creativity at all. No, it's not going to happen. That's not at all. I think look, Nils is always helpfully provocative and has a way of looking at the world, which I just love. I mean, he's got a brilliant perspective to challenge thinking. Now, I think where he's going and where the conversation was going there is that if you are a mediocre creative agency or your business is made on reproducing lots of versions of a particular ad, right, your business will be wiped out pretty quickly. If you want to get really good strategy, really good thinking, and creative at the highest level, that's where the value is going to be created. Because the interesting thing with AI is everyone's going to have the same tools. So SMEs are going to have the same tools as big companies, right? So AI democratizes access to, you can make a Hollywood look great ad now, right? Very cheaply. So suddenly, like, everyone's got the same tools they can make, but that means everyone's going to look the same. So good thinking and real creative thought is going to be absolutely the thing that discriminates. So I think people like Uncommon or Mischief, who I interviewed like the other day, those really clever thinkers that start on a strong insight about the audience, come up with a really good strategy, and then push the boundaries creatively and do things that capture attention and are really, really interesting and are unique and have got a rolling culture, all the kind of stuff that Nils talks about. That skill set cannot be replicated with AI. So I think there are winners and losers, and I think the likes of Uncommon are going to be winners in that situation.
And it's kind of interesting as well, because as I think about the marketing type of work that we do and how we use agencies, there's a good portion of money that we spend basically on capacity, not capability, right? Because of the variability of marketing budgets, because of the skills needed, because of the variability of what's needed from a business perspective. And I do think that a lot of agencies today do support CMOs a lot in terms of capacity. And that, if that starts to really shift, I think that changes the agency model quite significantly. Don't know if you've got a view about what do you think is going to happen to some of these agencies that have relied on that for quite a long time.
You're right, actually. And I've been in a situation when I've been CMO, I've done the in-housing of creative talent as well, brought the agency in-house. Right. And I've done exactly what you said because business goes through cycles, don't they? Where suddenly it's like, let's be more efficient by bringing expertise in-house. And then they go through a cycle of like, our overhead's got too big and it's let's outsource. And outsourcing is always like a bit of a false economy, I found, because you end up paying a fee on top and it's less efficient, the whole thing. So I think it's going to have quite a radical impact on that level of. So, for example, when I was at Lucozade, we in-housed and we discovered that we had 400 different versions of one trade ad, right? Because every magazine had its different sort of like angle or its different layout or its different kind of sizing or whatever sort of thing. Yeah. Now, we had to employ people to literally do 400 versions. And it was costing us £400,000, which actually was not a lot per thing. It's quite efficient. But £400,000 for one ad just appearing in the Waitrose magazine versus Booker's, whatever. So I think that is where mega efficiency is going to be realized. Now, the question is, what are you going to do with that efficiency? Are you going to take the opportunity to use that time saving and cost saving to be smarter and more interesting? This is the cost of dial point, right? You could use AI to create lots of advertising at mass and literally spend more money on more media, getting more boring advertising to more people, right? Or you can use it to do the efficiency job and really focus on effectiveness and getting that right. And that's probably what I think that's where the game is like, how can we be even more effective by using AI?
And even more memorable, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to ask a couple more questions to kind of see us out. We've talked about the incredible guests that you've had on this program. You obviously lead teams now and you have done in the past. As you talk to some of your guests, what are some of the things that you've learned about leadership and what takes a great leader in the marketing environment?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the thing that comes back to me regularly in the podcast, actually, I think it's a Ritson quote, but Corey says something quite similar, which is, as a CMO, your job is to represent the customer where decisions get made. And I think your power as a CMO in the boardroom is to be the voice of the customer. So I think that's probably the most powerful thing you can do, because at the end of it's a bit like a trump card, isn't it? It's like if you know how your customers think and feel and act and behave and so on, it gives you the credibility to justify your strategy and what you're going to do. So I think that's number one. That's really important. I think the second thing is working out how to make things happen. This is Corey's distance from decision to action. Right. I think figuring out how to execute is, and actually this is something I learned massively in my time at Seed Brands at Britvic and also in Purity, is in a smaller organization, you can execute so much quickly. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we would, we'd come up with an idea for a new juice at Purity, and then 4 weeks later it'd be down the production line into store. So I could negotiate with buyers, and they'd go, "Oh, we really need a pink lemonade or whatever," and I could go, "Done, I'll get it to you next month." And it would be like, I knew in a Britvic scenario that'd be an 18-month project that had to get signed off and evaluated with everything else. But understanding how to execute, I think, is really, really important. Then I think CMO responsibility is also about strategy for the company and thinking long term. So one thing I've noticed from all my conversations with CMOs, I regularly ask, what's the biggest problem you face, right? So many of them are going, we can't make the case for long-term brand building because we're under so much short-term pressure. But the CMO role of all the roles in the boardroom is the one that should be looking out, right? And I think this is where the data
future
helps.
Demand.
Yes,
all
exactly.
About future demand.
I know. And in B2B, we know this in B2B, don't we? My favourite stat is the 95-5 rule, right? Because suddenly you go, that one stat makes everything make sense. Totally. If most people, 19 out of 20 people, are not currently thinking about buying what you're selling today, but they may be in the future, you got to talk to those people. And those people matter. And the more you talk to those people and build reputation and future demand,
and you couple it with the data about if you're top of mind as they go into the buying process, you're much more likely to be successful. So those two things together, kind of a real pincer movement for brand building.
And this is where to plug your book is so brilliant. Is because you've thought about it through the different stages of buying from far out to near in. And that's absolutely critical. So I think the CMOs have got to think long term. So you've got to think about insight, execution, thinking long term. And then probably the fourth thing I'd say is about people. And I think probably the thing I wished I'd done more, I didn't even answer your question earlier about what's the one thing I got wrong that I wish I'd known. And it's probably actually managing the people, because I don't think in the past I spent enough effort on getting the culture right, really understanding what people needed from me in the team, and kind of assuming that they're okay when they weren't, and facilitating that kind of thing. And I think, people like yourself, people like Meg, Marg, Jobling, people like that who talk about their role as creating the environment for success to happen, and the ability to fail and still learn and carry on and get better, and creating those kind of environments. I think that's so critical for a CMO, because if you've got 50, 100, 150 people in your team and you can make them all successful, then you'll be wildly more successful than you can be on your own. And I think that ability is an ability I'm not good at and wish I'd had been better at.
We'll have to ask James, the producer, about that. So, love it. Okay, last question, thinking about your long-term future of the podcast. You've had some incredible people on.
Thank you.
This is your chance to make a pitch for the person you haven't had on yet that you would like to.
Well, this is definitely a fan favourite. And Kerry, who I must give a big shout out to.
She's wonderful.
Who's very talented and works so hard making this podcast a success. And her number one KPI for the last 2 years now has been Ryan Reynolds.
Love it.
I just think, well, look, he's an iconic. Well, look, he's a fascinating guy, super successful, so creative, and he's genuinely taken businesses. Now, he's used his celebrity fame to do it. I know that, but he's taken such a creative approach to the businesses he's bought, scaled, and sold. And I just think there's a lot to learn from him. And why has he bought Wrexham Football Club? I don't know. But, I just love to meet him and have a good conversation with him. It would be fun. And I think I could pack a fairly big audience for that one as well.
I think you'd have people outside the door. Well, I think I've learned a lot doing this podcast. And so, James, if you'd like me to do that Ryan Reynolds one, always available. I'll make space for that. Okay, so one of the things that Jon wasn't expecting on the podcast, but as well as achieving 150 episodes plus, congratulations, you have also managed to achieve a significant milestone birthday.
Oh, yeah.
So on behalf of all of the guests that you've had on in the past and all the guests that you win in the future, and on behalf of your team, we all wanted to say very happy 50th birthday, Jon.
You're so sweet. And you know what, we won't be able to quite see this on camera yet, but there's a Colin the Caterpillar coming, which I think is hilarious because, thank you.
Let's have
there we go, we'll get that on camera. The only time I've had to fire myself, apart from today when you've taken over the job, but the only time I've had to fire myself was Orlando and I have got this side podcast going called Never Mind the Adverts, and we just thought we try to do it as like a fun topical news show. So it's a bit of light entertainment. And it was his 50th birthday, and we bought him a Connie the Caterpillar.
Love it.
Because we wanted to link to Audi and talk about great advertising, all that kind of thing. And anyway, so it's his 50th. So we'd done the same thing. We got him a Connie the Caterpillar, and we were doing an episode on humour. And when you know someone really well, and you can just tell little nuances in their voice. Orlando has this like professor voice that he just puts on all of a sudden. He goes, well, it's a bit like David Attenborough.
I deduce.
Yes, we're looking at this species here, and deducing what they think about advertising. He has this like funny voice. Anyway, so I was saying, Orlando, tell me about the importance of humor in advertising. And he said, well, the funny thing about funny. And I just thought that little phrase when he went into his, I just cracked up. Anyway, so James had to stop the podcast, said, right, go again. And then literally, I could not hold it together. I was crying with laughter. I was red in the face. And in the end, I had to go, I'm sorry, I'm firing myself. I'm walking out. And then James brought Connie the caterpillar, and then we cut it again. And Orlando's basically talking to the caterpillar for the rest of the episode. So that's the only time that I failed to get through it. But anyway, thank you. So
well, happy birthday. Congratulations.
Thank you. Here's to another 50.
Yeah, thanks to Kerry and Freddie for...
Yeah.
Oh, did they? Kerry and Freddie. Oh, bless her. You see,
Kerry's been phenomenal.
Kerry's on holiday this week, but even on holiday, she's still working her magic behind the scenes.
I know, she's amazing.
So, and big thanks and love to producer James. James has been here, by the way, every single episode.
I know. Well, I heard you did
one.
the first interview with him when he did.
Yeah. In fact, James is the one that pushed me into this. We were chatting about. He was saying he loves podcasts. I'd never heard of podcasts before. Your
protege,
and he just said, "You like talking. It was like you like talking. You'll be good at this. It'll be fun. You can't do the rest of it. I'll do that. But that's fine. So we make a good team."
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for synthesizing everything that you've learned from this incredible series. It really is. And I would encourage anyone to go back through some of the titles, because you've really interviewed some phenomenal people. And it's just such a pleasure to listen to. Congratulations.
Thank
what
you.
an incredible achievement to get to over 150. Here's to 150 more.
Thank you.
Thank you for being my guest on Uncensored CMO.
Yeah.
And
thank you for doing it. And thank you too. And also I want to make sure I do say this as well. Like, having great guests makes this job easy, right? So I look good because I have good guests on there, right? And so I learn from the best, like you. So thank you for taking part, and everyone who's kind of generously given their time to do it. So it is only the sum of the guests, and they've been amazing. So
what a great note.
Well, may it continue.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you very much for listening or watching Uncensored CMO. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching, hit subscribe there as well. I'd also love to get a review. Reviews make a big difference on other people discovering the show. So please do leave a review wherever you get your podcast. If you want to contact me, you can do. I'm over on X at Uncensored CMO, or on LinkedIn, where I'm under my own name, Jon Evans. Thanks for listening and watching. I'll see you next time.